A lot was said about Andrew's amazing career, but we met when I was 21 and he was much older, and we were interns during the era of Ronald Reagan. So long ago was it. So if anyone else had done this, I'd have been very upset, because Andrew's a long-standing friend of mine. Andrew, the topics that are in this book concern everyone in the room, and there'll be a lot of expertise about climate change, and all of us are completely terrified about how no one's doing anything about it. But I just wondered why you have come to this book, to write this book, because your career was, as I know, humanitarian, political, war zones. So why have you written this book, which obviously needed to be written, but why has it been written by you?
Thank you. Well, I've actually been interested in many of the component parts of this question for a very long time. I joined sort of WWF youth service at age 10. I enjoyed Amnesty at 15. But for the next 40 years, I thought that these were entirely separate interests, in a way, like music and history. Really? Okay.
Don't need it.
No, apparently. Do I need it? Or? Yes. Okay, sorry. Through me. Where were they?
So you joined WWF?
So, yes, no, so I had a lifelong interest in these topics. And as you say, I then spent most of my career working on conflict. And then I left the UN at the end of 2019, and I applied for a fellowship at Oxford, and it was actually going to be on bringing together the environmentalist movement and the human rights movement, which historically had been often at loggerheads. And yet I felt that they had often many of the same, I had come to see that they had many of the same goals, and indeed many of the same enemies. I mean, it's no coincidence that the biggest climate change deniers running government are often major human rights abusers as well. And so I assumed I'd be working on that. But then in the meantime, I was given a job in Germany to run an organization working on conflict. And so I slightly narrowed the topic, and it seemed that people were beginning to talk about the links between climate change and conflict, but nobody had written a book about it. So I tried to bring that together. So that was essentially the genesis of that idea.
So I just wonder, in the rearview mirror, are there examples that we've been ignoring from history where a change of climate or a flood or a catastrophic drought or a famine led directly to conflict? So it's been there as a topic that we could have paid attention to and ignored. Are there things in history that everyone in the room will nod their head vigorously to?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there are certainly cases in history, but things like this weren't really talked about. I mean, I was a historian as an undergraduate, and the words environmental history had not been pieced together. And it's only subsequently, in the last 40 years, that people have begun to put this together. And there was a famous book written in 2005, a very popular book by Jared Diamond called Collapse, looking at a number of societies in Greenland, the Norse in Greenland, the Maya and the Assyrians, actually, all of whom had major climate shocks, but always at the same time as either having war with their neighbors or just unable to adapt. And then subsequently, I mean, one can look at changes. I mean, in the last 15 years, somebody, a well-known historian called Geoffrey Parker, did a major study of the 16th century to show that there was a climate change there that was connected to conflict and to upheaval. But the differences between that and now is that they were talking about only 1 degree of change, 2, that it was getting colder, not hotter, and 3, that change was not man-made, and it was not anthropogenic. And then there are other cases too. There was an El Nino in 1788, which has been pinned to various crises all over the world, as well as possibly accelerating the French Revolution and therefore linked to the Napoleonic Wars. And one can make sizable cases, good cases for all of those. But actually, they were relatively small compared to what we're going to see now, I'm convinced.
And I was amazed in reading the book. There was a drought in Scotland in the 17th century which fueled wars between the English and the Scottish.
Yes, and I'm actually Scottish, and I studied this particularly, but I never came across a reference to it. I mean, it was actually the worst drought in Scottish history between 1637 and 1649, which was combined with searingly cold winters. And looking at the evidence now, it is clear that there was a lot of extra misery, that it was not by any means the major. This was, of course, at the beginning of the English Civil War, which had very religious overtones, and the Scots, who were Calvinists, were very angry with the monarchy, which was seen as not being sufficiently Protestant. And so that was the main cause, but certainly the climate, or the weather, one might say, at that time would have been a contributory factor, yes.
So the book, Burning Question, links modern conflict and, unfortunately, future conflicts with climate change, our inability to tackle it, and also, chillingly, that tackling climate change itself could lead to conflict. So before we get into the book, can I just start by saying it might be useful to just do quickly, there is 2 conflicts at the moment which devote a lot of our attention in the news and in the room, and a lot of attention for the global north. And I want to put it to you that they have absolutely nothing to do with climate. Am I right? Looking at Ukraine and looking separately, but for this question linked, at the war in Gaza.
You are largely right.
Thank you very much.
I'm very clear
Great
on this.
use of the word largely.
I would never want to oversell the argument of this. I'm never going to say that even one conflict in the world is largely, or is, sorry, I will never say that even one conflict of the world is mainly caused by climate change for now. Certainly not saying all conflicts are. And the 2 you mentioned are clearly, climate change was not why Putin invaded Ukraine. Similarly, climate was not really connected at all to the Palestinian grievances that led to the Hamas horror operation and then the Israeli even more horrifying counter, what we've seen in the last 2 years. But I would say that in all of these things, though, climate does play a role. And I mean, there have been, it's going to be, it's by no means, and when the Arab-Israeli conflict started in, well, one could say at any time, but certainly in 1948, nobody was mentioning this as a cause at all. But I can say, though, that subsequently the shortage of water as a result of climate change, the reduced rainfall, and the fact that the Israelis have taken complete control of the aquifers, both of the West Bank and of Gaza, will make it that much harder to find a solution. So I'm definitely not saying climate change is the cause of what happened in Gaza or Ukraine.
And it's also notable that today the Ukrainians have breached a dam in Russia, and 18 months ago the Russians bombed a dam in Ukraine. So you are saying, no, these conflicts are not about climate change, but guess what? Modern warfare is going to use the climate as much as it can against our enemy. That's what will start to happen. And one just tries to think of the impact of all these blazing parts of the world on the climate itself. The attack on oil refineries, that's not helping the world, is it?
Which attacks are you talking about?
So when the oil refineries are set alight as they are in Russia, this is an example of climate action from war.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, one could say that I mean, I saw unbelievable figures, more than the setting up of a refinery. I mean, for example, the energy that was used by the Americans and to a lesser extent the Germans to to arm the Israelis so that they could drop those bombs on Gaza. I've now forgotten what the figures are, and certainly any war leads to major increases of emission, that's for sure.
Now, what is the burning question that the book is entitled after? What is the burning question? And don't reply to say a book available to be signed shortly. What is the burning question?
I hope I don't oversell anything. Perhaps the only thing I do oversell is by saying it's the burning question rather than a burning question. But I would say it is that, first of all, how do we get people to understand that there is a much greater link between climate and conflict than people have understood so far? And secondly, what the bloody hell do we do about it? I would say that was the question. And how do we approach them together? Because, I mean, just on the 2 components, on conflict, we have more conflicts than at any time since 1945 at the moment. And we have an ever faster increase of emissions. So the two things are going to become more and more, if you accept, as I do, that there is a link, and then both of these other two factors are increasing, then they're going to become ever more intermingled. And then, so how do we react to that?
So thank you then, because that was really what I wanted to do to get us going, to now talk about examples that will, in your book, prove your case. So can we start with a part of the world in the north, but not the most northerly part of Africa? And can you tell me why, what's the name of this area, and what it does for your central argument that climate change is fueling conflict?
Right. Well, there's the whole swath or swathe of the area, basically from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, from Mauritania and Senegal all the way across to Somalia. And what that area has in common, other than being absolutely vast and inherently unstable, is that there has been increased desertification and increased drought, which leads to tension in every single one of those 15 countries concerned, whereby extra pressure on land and on water leads people to either radicalization or to conflict, or to tensions with other communities, or to migration, actually, but we can come to migration more, because that is really a central point that I'd like us to talk about. But in that area, we find, so in particular, tensions between the two broadly speaking, types of farmers: the agriculturalists, the sedentary farmers who settle and plant crops, and the pastoralists, the herdsmen, who find that their traditional grazing grounds for their animals, their cattle, their camels, and their goats and their sheep are shrinking, and it brings them into conflict with the people who have spent long time planting their crops, who understandably get extremely angry when people come in with guns and start feeding their animals on their crops. And it leads to violence, and it's been particularly dangerous in Nigeria in recent years, but one could say almost the same about every other country as well. And indeed, you may remember what was called the first genocide of the 21st century, Darfur, from about 2003 to 2006. That was indeed, I mean, again, I wouldn't want to say that the primary cause was climate. But at that time, I was working for the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And he, I mean, we drafted it for him, wrote an article for the Washington Post saying that a cause of what was going on in Darfur was the fact that there had been so many years of drought, it had become a vast dust bowl, basically. And so people were unable to feed either their camels or to plant crops, and terrible fighting broke out. Trouble is, and we probably got the balance wrong. Well, we definitely didn't say it was the only cause, and we certainly weren't exonerating the government in Khartoum or the Janjaweed, the terrible militia that was carrying out the atrocities. But there was a strange alliance, believe it or not, between the Bush administration, climate deniers, and the human rights community, who all got very angry about that article. And I think it was demonstrably correct, as it happens, but it was like the first time. And in fact, just last year, the Economist described it as the first climate war in history. And so that would be a particularly acute, and now it's happening again. And indeed, the capital of Darfur fell to a particularly unpleasant group that's been fighting over it for the last few years. Actually, the people who've inherited the mantle of the Janjaweed, backed unfortunately by the Emiratis, who have captured this. So this has been running on and on. So that particular place, but in more or lesser extent, that whole vast area of Africa is suffering from these problems.
So this, for me, having read the book, is perhaps the newest thing in it. And when it's your turn, and I know there's a lot of expertise in the room, this idea that I set up that war can be political, i.e. look at Ukraine, and in fact, what you're saying is that it's so unpopular to say that you don't know why you're being political. There are things that are motivating you as a nation state, but they are the climate. They are the fight for your people's interests, based on the fact that there's dwindling water in the river, that there's dust where there used to be soil that you could grow crops in. So actually, you are really talking about a form of new thinking. I asked you at the very start, given that you'd worked in conflict zones, why, after you've left the UN, are you joining the dots? So why is there resistance to the idea that the climate is fueling conflict? Why did the human rights people get so grumpy with you for saying that?
Back then, the human rights community got angry because they thought we were trying to say that it wasn't the fault of the Janjaweed, who subsequently did commit a genocide. I mean, it was clearly spelled out later in various legal processes. But so by suggesting that it was somehow the climate, the implication was that we were letting the bad guys off the hook.
That's very interesting, isn't it? Because it would give a lot of cover to climate change not being addressed. If we kept just concentrating on the bad guys, we wouldn't realize that humanity is across a border and thus a shared bad guy when it comes to influencing the climate. So it's actually a new thinking that would be required for you to make any progress with this argument, because you're really arguing for enemies to cooperate as much as you are for friends to cooperate.
Right. I have to say, I do think, and this is one area where one can be a bit optimistic, that reluctance by the human rights community back then would not happen now. I think generally, and that's why I told you at the beginning I wanted to actually to start working rather than quite this book, a slight variant of it, is to bring the human rights and the environmentalist communities together, and their activists and their organizations together. I think they are now more closely, and I think they have begun to understand that they are fighting the same enemies, and they are, and I've noticed that the human rights organizations do now see that climate is a massive challenge, not only because it undermines everybody's rights to water, to food, to employment, to education and everything else, and health in particularly, but actually because, and this was made by a very strong UN human rights rapporteur back in 2019, that actually the human rights community, when he excoriated the human rights community for not having understood the gravity of the situation, which is when the world's community finally does wake up to the enormity of climate change, how are they going to react to the fact that we have been so useless at addressing it? And there is even a danger that people might, at that point, say, "Well, look, democracy does not work. Look at the Chinese. Look at the amount of solar voltaic panels they are able to produce compared to the entire rest of the world put together. Look, when they start moving on things, what they're doing, and we just carry on bickering and talking about the climate hoax and net zero and all that stuff, and not really addressing it." So and I do share that, by the way. I think there is a danger that the failure of democracies to address this could lead to people saying, as always happens in an emergency, people just put human rights on the back burner, and look what we did in the Second World War to people with German names or things like that. People always put human rights to one side, and I think when the climate emergency really hits, that could happen.
Yes, let me get into that. I'm going to move on from this part of Africa and pick you up on what you just said. Andrew's talking to us about the Sahel, which I have to say I had to go and look up. And I'm sorry to everyone in the room who would hope that I would know what it is. But it's 15 countries from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, 3,600 miles. It's just below the north coast of Africa. And we've just said that there are 15 countries there with conflicts within and between them, fueled by the soil turning into dust, the rivers drying up, the herding farmers moving on to the pasture farming. And then when you raise these issues, people don't like to be told they're linked. They prefer to see a political reason, a religious reason. There's some resistance in the way we view the world in seeing this new thinking. Guys, calm down, they're all linked. If you could get together, they're all actually linked.
Yeah, I would say that. Although there is there is growing recognition of this.
It's fine if you want to agree with me. That's enough, because I want to move on. Because otherwise you're going to disagree with me, and I don't like it when you do that. So just talking about democracies. So I take wildfires in California, for instance, and in a great democracy fueled by the angry algorithms and the polarized America, I can argue about why those wildfires happen. And similarly, in Greece, when they happen now, I can blame them on arsonists. And between all the democracies of the West, it's difficult, for the reasons I've just outlined, it's difficult for people to form an international alliance that says there's a link. People are atomized in their own democracies, and they're arguing with each other about other matters. So is it possible, if I can just drill into the democracy thing, because of all the shouty, angry tone about absolutely everything, is that also making it hard, a resistor to people tackling the climate change that is burning their houses down, because they prefer to argue about why their house is burning down instead of linking all the burning house downs with all the floods that then follow in the autumn? Is that worth us discussing about our democracies and our arguments?
Yeah, I mean, I think in every country, either highly developed economic ones, such as ours, or places that we're talking about there, that there is a lack of awareness. So people often might even hear not piece everything together. And we certainly find the organizations that I was working on, either the UN or later, in some of these conflict zones in the Sahel and also Syria and Iraq. You sit down with people, and they know that they are suffering worse weather than their parents did. They know that droughts happen more often. They know that flash floods happen more often. And they also know that after every one of these, there's an uptick in recruitment to extremist organizations. Now, in the western Sahel, around Lake Chad and Nigeria, it's Boko Haram. In the east, in Somalia, it's Al-Shabaab, it's Al-Qaeda, and it's Islamic State. I mean, there are several, and there are many other groups as well, all of whom get an extra benefit when bad weather comes, as people have lost their livelihoods and they are ever more desperate. But when you sit people together, as we have done in Somalia and Iraq and various other places, you find that they are aware of this, but they didn't know that even the whole country was facing it, let alone the whole world was facing this problem. And actually, it can be used, but it's not being used nearly enough because the funding for it has been so limited so far, is that actually one could use this as a form of environmental peace building, persuading people who hitherto had no idea. They just realized that they were getting less water, so they blamed their neighbors, who they always hated anyway, for damming the water, even if they weren't doing so. But they just assumed it was them, and they got angry with each other. But then when they started discovering that their neighbors were suffering too, and the whole government, and the whole country and government, and indeed the region and the world, suddenly it changes for the better, actually.
And so could you just come to Somalia again to ask you for a bit more detail, but just on the West, the way that we argue means that although there is consensus, I suspect, in this room, it's very difficult to imagine the countries of the West aligning over a target to bring down fossil fuel emissions. It seems that we can't cooperate at the moment. People might want to say there's a big role of the big emitters, or people might choose to blame all of us. But what do you say about our own attempts to cooperate in the West, before I come back to Somalia? How do we look as Western nations who were the big polluters? How do we look at cooperating on this topic?
Well, this is a really huge issue, and moving totally away from then our, I mean, how we are perceived. And I think this perception is going to increase. It is seen as unbelievable hypocrisy that we developed our economies. We actually used the proceeds of slavery to develop industries that then led us to have the Industrial Revolution before anybody else. We then used the proceeds of that to colonize large parts of the world, kept them in a state of not really being able to develop their own economies, and now we're going around saying to them, chaps, frankly, sorry, you've just found a new gas field there, but we don't think you should develop it because it will damage the environment. I mean, and that is actually what we've been doing in some places, we Westerners. So, but this is a whole new topic to talk about, but and it brings up the whole issue of climate justice, which maybe you might talk about later.
Yes, I would like to do that. So let me just move from the parts of the world that we have briefly discussed, which prove your point in your book at least, to migration. And this seems to be a very big topic in the UK at the moment in the news. I think people understand, people are on the move. But of course, in history, this is really easy to understand. Big populations have moved when the climate changes, that we talk about pull factors and push factors, and a sharp drought, a massive flood, a huge change in circumstances, the eruption of a volcano has led populations to move. They're push factors. So do you think that when it comes to societies around the world, including the West, climate's impact on migration is easier for them to get to grips with than the main part of your book, which is that climate change fuels conflict? Do you think everyone on all sides of political debate understands that climate change, whoever caused it, and you say it's clearly us, climate change is going to lead to more migration than we've ever seen in human history? Is that understood? Did everyone agree?
Probably here they do, but absolutely they don't agree with that, because there is some, I mean, it's a very perverse irony, is that the people who most dislike migration are almost invariably the people who are the climate skeptics. And we see that with Trump, we see that with the Tory party now, not the old Tory party necessarily, but certainly now. Farage, of course, we see that with the AfD in Germany, we see it with Le Pen. It's very, very widely now that the most anti-immigrant people are those who also deny the realities of climate. And that has a very perverse set of impacts as well. On the one hand, it means that they are also extremely anti any foreign aid, so they don't want to contribute to funds that would actually make people's lives better, less unbearable in the areas that are most affected by climate change, and therefore who would otherwise, therefore might be heading in our way. And it also means that they gain electorally by the fact that there are immigrants coming in, and which they then use for political purposes. And the fact that they are coming in because of the climate change that they are denying is very ironic. And the rest of us who are not in that camp have had great difficulties breaking that vicious sort of cycle of issues.
Because that's why it's important to break down the real truth. So if people are moving as economic migrants, often in the news business, we say that's very different from the people who fled the Nazis, for instance. If you fled on the Kindertransport, that's different from if you're just swapping your life chances in one country for another. So there must be a proportion of the migration which is economic migrants trying to improve their chances. But is there a way of verifying how many people are moving in order not to die over there because there's no more soil? Is there anyone who's trusted to say the difference between an economic migrant? Do we even know what the bench line is for having a sensible argument among the nations of the world?
Right. I think we do know what they are, but they are going to be incredibly hard to get to because, of course, in your first category, that they are what in international law, and they're refugees, people who are fleeing, as you mentioned, the Kindertransport, a fear of persecution. But unfortunately, there has been, and I don't see any likelihood of it changing, given the way member states that would be involved in changing this, the 1951 refugee agreement, whereby the idea of climate refugees is not accepted. And so there is no real, certainly no legal understanding on the part of, in the eyes of international law.
You see, I find that really new. I hadn't thought of that before. I do understand what a political refugee is. My dad landed at D-Day, and I can see that he fought fascists. I can really get that. But I haven't been educated in the idea of a climate refugee. Maybe in the room everyone has been. Maybe you're going to tell me you've already come up with those two words together. But I think that's a new idea, and I think it'll probably be fought. But I think everyone can understand that there must be climate refugees in the low-lying islands, in the coastal communities that are flooding, and in the places that are catching alight. But is it going to be difficult to see anyone want to admit there are millions and millions of climate refugees? Do I need to be optimistic that the logic of it will convince people that climate refugees is a term we have to start adopting?
It will be fought tooth and nail for both reasons. I mean, as I said, people deny climate change and they deny they don't want refugees. So they will fight the linkage exponentially, not just arithmetically, between the two the two factors. I do, and I try to give a slightly optimistic case that in the end, it will become so crystal clear that people are not fleeing just because they want a better life, but because their lives are literally unbearable in the places where frequently 50 degrees is going to be the norm. And you cannot, you can't live there, let alone produce your food and maintain a life there. So, and they will be coming to the areas that are still much more agreeable to live in, such as Northern Europe.
And where is the big movement happening right now?
It's mainly happening within countries, by the way. It's not coming... so the people who are on the front line of this are not the rich Western countries. The people who are having to, as by the way with political refugees too, we talk so much, and we took, I mean, in Syria, Turkey, it took, I can't remember, was it 3 million? But we took like 12,000 and boasted about it. Always, countries that surround a war zone take the vast bulk of the refugees. And that's the same with climate. They're called now migrants, but we can call them climate refugees. But sooner or later, though, I mean, you can't just keep those areas within their own countries that they're fleeing to are sooner or later going to become unbearable as well. So they're going to have to go further than that, their own regions.
Yeah, so I'm surprised that you're saying it's so contentious, because if there's only so much land, and the land is shrinking because the seas are rising and other bits of it are becoming too hot, surely the case is made that climate change is going to lead to migration. Surely it's made because there isn't as much land as there was that is habitable. There must be a way of saying, you can argue about how many of these people are political and economic migrants, but the world does agree that there are climate refugees. So can I not say that we've reached that point?
I mean, it's blindingly obvious to us, yes. But I mean, if you combine the people who vote Tory or Reform now, who would absolutely disagree, as I said, with both ends of that point, and then more voters than not in America voted for Trump, who says climate change is a hoax. It is one thing it is not. It is agreed. It may be totally obvious and self-evident, but it's not agreed.
It's not really so much about voting, is it? Because they might agree that there are climate refugees. They just might say we don't want to be responding to it by having them come here. But it might be that humanity does agree there are climate refugees if parts of the world start sinking. I mean, it wouldn't be the case that you could say they haven't sunk. And it wouldn't be the case that there are cliffs I can take you to. We can go to the pub afterwards. Yeah. And the cliff in England had a house on it, which was 40 feet near the sea, and now there's no cliff and there's no house. So that we do know that the land is shrinking.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I can imagine in the pub there'll be people who say erosion wasn't invented in the last 30 years. I mean, cliffs have been eroding since the Norman Conquest, and obviously well before. I mean, I do wonder. I mean, when it becomes ever clearer that people are having to leave, I do maintain the hope that the current people who are Cassandras at the moment, saying this is a real problem and we need to start agreeing to it, I think will be proven right. But we just seem to be an awfully long way from that now.
So I want to do some hope as well, actually. And I wonder, can I, just before I get to the hope, ask about catastrophe, which is it useful to catastrophize? And in the room are people who deal with climate for a living and will know this argument, so I won't waste their time. If you tell me as a citizen or a political leader it's over, there's no point me doing anything. So what would your argument be? Hope will obviously be important. Is there agency? Is it worth catastrophizing if you want to get action from populations in the world?
Yeah. That's obviously a major tactical issue, and I take the view, for example, a very leading climate activist and scientist, Michael Mann in the United States, who attacked David Wallace Wells for his sort of the uninhabitable Earth, and saying that basically the Earth is burning before our eyes, And the line of the first guy, Michael Mann, is to say, look, the situation is bad enough without having to make it even worse. Moreover, it then allows people to say, as you've heard them say, and probably on your program, you've probably heard people saying, look, this guy here said that the world would be over in 2017, and look where we are now. I mean, what an idiot. I mean, so I think catastrophizing overstating it is definitely not a good idea.
A mistake. It would be a mistake.
Yeah.
But
it's bad enough because it's bad enough without overstating it.
So it would mean that the hope that you're promised us, and we won't leave without, the hope is important to not catastrophize, because you would be able to say, here are 10 examples of mitigations, or whatever the phrase is, adaptations. Here are reasons that things can change. So the hope is part of the reason why there's no need to catastrophize, or you shouldn't waste time catastrophizing. Is that you nodding or falling asleep? I can't tell.
Well, the main reason I would say is because you don't need to, and you can be easily disproven. And people just say, whatever the chap cried wolf. I mean, it doesn't work. But I definitely do want to draw attention to the situation.
Yeah,
but just not overdoing it.
Okay, fine. And then the other main broad thing I wanted to get to before the hope is climate justice is a phrase which comes laden with accusations that it's anti-Western, that it's all part of this kind of anti-colonial movement, and it's a way of just simply hating on the West again. You've already implied there are many reasons to hate on the Western history, but is there, just as there's a risk of catastrophizing, is there a risk that all calls for climate justice are necessarily anti-Western?
I mean, obviously justice is supposed to be blind, so it's neither anti-Western or anti-Eastern or anybody else. No, climate justice, and there is a really striking change in various audiences that I've come across, speaking about my book and other issues. When I talk to young people, like at the universities, everybody knows what climate justice is. But I've noticed, and I can't see it because of the light here, but with older groups, and I'm not saying this is an older group, they can be very, very blank expressions, and I've seen that, and they've never heard the expression before. So that is a big difference between generations, is understanding that climate justice is a thing. Now, climate justice is basically, if I could just put it in one tiny sort of capsule, there is, I mean, Somalia is the country that possibly is the world's worst affected by climate change. And yet, its emissions since 1960 combined, so very nearly 65 years, is less than the Americans have done in the last 2.5 days. And yet, they are suffering for emissions that are not their fault. And they are in desperate trouble, and their ecology, their livelihoods, they are in many places unable to live and work, and not just because it's getting hot, but also because it then links to the conflict, which then makes their lives that much harder. So I think that the fact that the younger generation is much more aware of this means that it will become more acceptable. And after all, it's not intrinsically I mean, climate justice means that, it was our emissions that had to do something. And it very much is our emissions, by the way. There is more carbon in the environment, in the atmosphere than there had since we were undergraduates, and there's been more since the late 80s than everything before. So it is our generation at a time when the people back then were already beginning to shout the alarm and being told and being bought off by the climate deniers, and other people were being paid to disparage their arguments. So I think that there will be a growing acceptance of this. But again, we're a long way from that.
So Lily's looking at me, which is a sign that we're coming to your questions very shortly. So let's just do some of the hopes. I think we've done some of the major themes, and it's not to say that we've done them to the best of my ability. I'm sure that you could have been challenged much more cleverly than I've tried. But we've addressed some of the themes in your book, and we've got to some of the new thinking and some of the resistance from people to be told that climate can be explaining political differences. So, and I found that very interesting. And I found climate refugee to be a new phrase to me as well, but I'm sure that means I'm behind the time. So, Hope, can you give me a reason to be cheerful? I understand that there are some agricultural changes which have been made, which have been successful. I understand, for instance, that gender plays a part in this. Now, I don't want to go into a culture war. I just want to be factual that the Grameen Bank found that if it gave women cell phones, it could bring down the cost, it could bring up the cost they were being paid for crops. And it was already proven in facts that bankers agree with that a change of how business was being done, how agriculture was being done, could mitigate and change conflict in communities. And I'm glad to say you're actually nodding your head. So are there reasons to show that humans can address climate change together? Are there things that have worked? Are there projects which are showing what cooperation and comprehension can do in addressing climate change?
Yes, I mean, obviously the main thing humans can do is to wean themselves off fossil fuels, but that's not the argument. That's not the topic of today. But that's the main thing to be done. But there are certainly areas where one can improve. That would to address the mitigation issue of reducing emissions. But
can you give me an example?
Yeah, of what?
Of something that's worked.
Yeah, I was about to.
It looks like you're pointing at your book.
No, but no. I said this book though is not about mitigation. It's about adaptation. It's not telling people that they've got to reduce their emissions. It is how are they going to be able to handle, cope with the fact that the climate is getting so much worse for them and leading them into conflict. I would say that there are certainly forms of agriculture. There's just one that I find very interesting: the system of rice intensification, which is a really revolutionary approach that's been tried in many parts of Africa and in Afghanistan and elsewhere in South Asia, which has a way of the seeds are cheaper for the farmers. It triples their yield, the farmer's yield. It produces way less methane, which is an incredibly dangerous non-carbon greenhouse gas, and it is generally, and then when you can find ways that are very good at adapting to serious climate change, agricultural way, whether it's sort of drought-resistant seed or, as I said, this form of rice intensification, that could actually allow people to live in their places and not actually either feel the need to fight or to flee.
So if we could have the lights up, and then I'll come into you in just a second. If you could wave a wand, what would you do more of yourself?
If I could wave a wand, I'd say two things. One, and I'll just really talk very briefly on that one. One is just for Western leaders to start, because essentially not a single one is doing so, understanding that there is going to be a vast increase of climate refugees and start preparing our societies for it in a way that therefore it doesn't just benefit the terrible guys who want to whip up hatred towards those refugees. And then the other one, I have hopes in the issue of climate litigation, whereby there has been a lot of improvement, a lot of very positive cases over the last 5 years, whereby the polluters have been taken to court and being hit in their pocketbook. And there have been major cases in that. What I would most like to see is somehow a mass class action taken against the Murdoch empire. And it couldn't happen in the United States because it would be I mean, the First Amendment would never get anywhere. I mean, but elsewhere, the fact that for decades, pumping out in the United States through Fox News here and in Australia, endless falsehoods about climate and helping to discredit the whole idea of climate change, that somehow there could be a class action that says not only that the direct polluters like Shell and Exxon have to pay, but the people who deliberately disseminated false information and prevented action being taken, and that therefore what my wand would be that the billions that would be handed over would then go to these communities in South Asia and the Middle East who have suffered.
Yeah, I mean, that really is wizardry, because, I mean, I can't see a court agreeing with that analysis I mean, you were very strong. You got some applause for it, but that's wandage of the maximum. Never mind cakeage. That's wandage, because the idea that people aren't even watching the news. They don't care about facts anymore, do they? That's part of the problem. You can't. If only facts were disputed and listened to, Andrew. But anyway, can we have the microphones round the room, Lily? And we can't see anything. There are hands going up. You can be completely anonymous. Here we go. Would you like to give us a first name or make one up if necessary, if you work, for Rupert Murdoch, for instance?
I don't work for Rupert Murdoch. My name's Guy. I'm an analyst at Sightline Climate. Thank you for the interesting reflections. I wanted to ask about the sort of second-order impacts of climate refugees. Assuming for, as you said, economic and cultural reasons, most refugees will be to neighbouring countries. What do you foresee as the major impacts on those countries being in terms of economic, security and political effect of potentially, if you're India, millions of refugees from Pakistan or Bangladesh moving into the country?
Well, I can tell you where I've seen that, and it had a very, very negative effect, and it happened in Iraq and Syria, and I would say was instrumental in the rise of the Islamic State, ISIL or ISIS, that burst onto the world's attention in 2014. Now that had been preceded by what is regarded as the worst drought in human history since Mesopotamia was first sort of a civilization there. And I was living there, and this sounds a really first world problem, but the helicopters you couldn't get off in your helicopter because there were dust storms, and I didn't really, nobody really realized that this was part of this massive drought that destroyed the livelihoods and the farmlands of tens of thousands of people who had to leave and move to the cities. Now, what happened in the cities of both Iraq and Syria was that these were mainly Sunni farmers who arrived absolutely destitute to new urban settings, and they were overwhelmingly Sunni, and their governments were Alawite in Damascus and Shiite after the American invasion in 2003. So they were very fertile ground for moving into ISIS. So that would be one example that I know, that essentially if very poor people move from an area into towns, that's never going to be a good thing.
And presumably another thing is urbanization. That's been the mega cities are caused in part by migration and based on climate change.
They are, absolutely.
Can we have there's loads of questions, but would it be wrong to turn the lights on in this building? I mean, is that an energy saving measure? Here we go. Please give us a first name.
Hi, I'm Katie. I don't work in this, but I've done an awful lot of protest. And part of the protesting is what's made me so angry about the way that we keep shielding the arseholes that are making the problem. And I'm just wondering, because capitalism is sadly ridiculously clever and capable at keep on making money. And I'm just wondering, it's really difficult to speculate on motives, but what is it that you think? Because insurance companies know what's coming. A lot of the big companies know, and yet they keep on sending out lobbyists to counter any issue. And I think lobbying should be made absolutely illegal. They've absolutely scuppered the plastics treaty. It's just made me so sad for you to hear you identify the localized conflict and localized loathing between people that we have caused. And I just wondered what you feel, how these big polluters see their future, because they're killing their customers ultimately. So why aren't they making more effort? I don't know whether you see that, or is it that the big military companies just make so much blooming money as well that they don't care? I'm sorry, I'm struggling to have a real question here, but it's just hard to see why these companies that are causing the problem just keep going and keep going when we can all see how awful things are.
Yeah, I mean, I can why they're doing it, it doesn't answer your real question of how can they do it and look themselves in the mirror, but the fact that they have such a congenial atmosphere in Washington right now with Trump, and the fact that nobody really wants to stand up to him, and therefore there's been a huge pushback. I mean, one shouldn't, that's not forever. I mean, there was a lot of progress being made before. I mean, not nearly fast enough, but at least it was definable progress and you could see it. But now it's certainly going back, and for the next couple of years, nevertheless, there are still encouraging aspects. That there have still been some good law cases. There was a very good ICJ ruling in July that is saying that polluters will have to pay and for their damage as a result of the climate change having created such misery in the various communities. So it's not all bad. I mean,
also, can I just say that you're mentioning the sales of photovoltaic cells. The technology is greatly improving, partly fueled by capitalism. There are great moves in technology if people want to use them, political leaders want to use them. Businesses, if the question says business is bad, do you support that view? Business is bad? Because, I mean, if 80% of the world is a fossil fuel economy, what hope is there if you go around just saying all business is bad, which is, presumably not quite what our question is saying. But do you get what I'm saying?
I do, and I think business has to be and will be the key to this, because whatever the climate in Washington, there is still going to be. I mean, we know. I mean, there were definitely people here who know more than I do about it, but we know that in the issue of electric vehicles, in the issue of storage batteries, for photovoltaic and for wind turbines, there is huge progress and a reduction in the price as a result of them. And sooner or later, these tipping points will lead to progress. I mean, of course, what we're all worried about is that it's too late.
There are hands up everywhere.
But it's
that's too long, your answer. That's too long. And it wasn't even your question that all business is bad. But I'm a host, and I have to get binary opinions, or it won't work.
Hi, I'm Ian. 2 years ago, I was at the DSEI, which is the UK's largest arms fair, and a very excited BAE.
Were you buying or selling?
I was investigating, and BAE Systems was a very excited salesman there, offering me a carbon zero bomb. Now, we live in a time when the military-industrial complex is flexing its arms. The UK's MOD is the largest emitter of CO2 in any government agency. Last year, our people from the MOD travelled to 136 countries. So is there a tension here that there's a kind of, on the one hand, you've got the securitization of borders, the militarization of borders, and yet the military are the world's worst producers of CO2 in the military-industrial complex framing? And how do you align that tension, as we're going to have more and more tensions and more call for the defense of borders? The very organizations that are tasked with defending the borders are the ones who are sort of fueling climate change.
Yeah, no, I mean, sure, but that's not going to convince them. Having said that, I do believe that actually, in fact, there was an article just 2 days ago or 4 days ago in The Guardian of a number of generals, General Nugi, UK, and several other ones, saying that a large proportion of the, how we have to give 3.5% of budget to defense and 1.5% in related stuff like infrastructure. They're saying that a large part of the 1.5 should go into climate change or climate resilience and enabling us to produce much more renewable energy, precisely because our reliance on fossil fuels is a security risk for us. So they're not all blind to this, and the US military is by no means not all blind to this as well, but that would be giving it too long an answer if I get into that.
But there is increased militarization. Our friend is correct. And loads of questions here, but you haven't got the microphone.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for the talk. I'm George. You speak about temperature ticking up and conflict ticking up. Quick question, which ecological tipping points should we be looking out for? And I imagine that relationship's not linear, and the next degree is more important than the degree after that. Thank you.
I'm not the guy to answer that. I'm sorry.
George, can you keep the microphone?
It's a very good question. I just happen
but George,
not to know the answer.
Can you give the microphone back to George? George, can you just tell me what would be an appropriate answer? Because it's possible by asking it, you're well briefed. Give us an answer, or where we should be looking to
I'm
answer.
a postgraduate student. It was a genuine question.
Yeah. Right. Well, thank God, you give me hope. Yeah. So I thought that because of your study, you might know where we should be looking for an answer, because I've learned that about the audiences. There's more knowledge sometimes in there than up here, although not in this case, of course. Hello.
Yes, my name is Guy. My question is about, you mentioned about the EV batteries and energy storage has a reason for hope, but those EV batteries and energy storage relies on critical minerals. And the way those are, extracted cause biodiversity destruction. How do you correlate both?
That is a really good question. I thought you were going to ask me that, actually, but there's a whole chapter in this book pointing out that actually it's not just climate change itself that can cause conflict. It's the measures that we take against climate change that can also lead to conflict as well. And one of the examples I use is, of course, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. 70% of the world's cobalt is there, and they're the 7th largest reserves of copper, both of which are absolutely vital for any renewable energy. And what we are certainly seeing there is that this is an added source of, first of all, terrible human rights abuses, as children are having to work in these artisanal mines in unspeakable conditions and are beaten and worse for not producing enough. And secondly, armed groups have a really vested interest in controlling them. And as the prices of these, particularly those two minerals, are going to increase very much, I think, lithium and copper, it means that the motivation for the armed groups to actually take control of them will be even stronger. So it's a very, very worrying factor. So what I'm just saying, and the whole argument is that it's not just climate itself, it is our measures taken against climate. We have to be much more conflict sensitive in addressing those.
We are. Can you want to give the microphone to this gentleman here?
Thank
and
you.
then on your left.
Good evening, Mahdi from Lawyers for Justice in Libya. So climate crisis, already started, but we didn't really kick off yet the major impact, and including on migration. Yet we already see in Europe and in the West already movements really taking increasingly strong position against migration, including now calling for deportation of legal residents and so on. So migration crisis didn't start yet, and we are seeing this. So how can we expect things to evolve in the future on this point? And as we see these far-right movements coming to power, how can we expect any sense of climate justice policies and positions? Thank you.
One of the, I think I get the sense of your question. I regard it as one of the scandals of the developed world is the way the European Union, and I'm not exonerating the British from that, are handling Libya, and the fact that we are paying the Libyan Coast Guard to stop migrants, many of whom are climate refugees, in fact, from coming over and carrying out, and they are, I once went into a camp of people who had actually been repatriated to Niger from Libya, and every single person I spoke to, man, woman, boy, and girl, had been raped, and and that was 6 years ago, and it's got a lot worse since then. So what we have to do is to keep pressure on the EU and on the British and on anybody else to ensure that we don't have this utterly inhumane way of dealing with people who need to leave their countries.
There's loads of questions here. Do you want to be... Asha, you need to be quicker with your microphone.
Hi there, my name's Miriam. I'm an American. I spent a lot of time in the California, in the what we would call as the Innovation Center of the world. And I came here and joined a great British company that did a lot of things for this country. It opened the North Sea. You know what I'm talking about, and then tried to affect an energy transition within this company. And the capitalist system, which is basically dominated by the U.S., said, no, we don't like what you're doing. We want you to just keep pumping hydrocarbons instead of making an energy transition. And it just makes me wonder, can you do climate justice, all the great things you've been talking about today, in a democratic society? I am just not sure. And I really, China, I was in the US when Trump was saying there's no climate emergency, and Xi the next day said we're going to be 30% renewables.
Okay, let's just take the question, because time's scampering on. Can you address calls for climate justice in a democratic society?
No, that's why I said earlier that some people in the human rights community feel that they haven't woken up enough to the dangers of this, and that there will be a major reaction against democracy. I'm not going to be say that I go along with that too far, but I see the concern.
But it's addressed, it's coming up in the room. Thank you very much. Have you got a new one with the mic?
Hi, just Sarah Field. I'm from Sand Dams Worldwide. Just a quick one on the postgraduate student question, which is, I think, related to Johan Rockstrom's work on planetary boundaries and all the tipping points and systemic stuff. I'm sure everybody in this room probably knows what that is, so I don't need to go any further. But second thing was, I think there's a lot of hope, actually, and I'd like to just talk about restoring farming land across all those ACEL countries of Africa. There's lots of people in this club actually working on various different initiatives to restore soil, to do landscape scale restoration, to plant, to enable locally led adaptation to climate change and mitigation of all those issues. So there is actually hope, and if enough of us can get behind those initiatives, we can at least start to offset some of the other terrible stuff that's going on. So I just think, you know, sometimes it's quite good to have a bit of a positive attitude and get behind some of the great nature-based landscape-wide solutions that are actually emerging to do things like solve water scarcity and ACELs.
I totally agree. Thank you for that.
Also, can I just say that is a large part of Andrew's book is the use of agriculture as the reason for solution-based hope. And if I didn't bring that out as chair, that's my mistake, and you just have.
Hi, I'm Isaac, and I'm very interested in the matters of the Middle East and how brittleness in politics and brittleness in the ecological brittleness, they could feed into each other. And I'm curious what can you say about questions of governance? Like, for example, if you take Syria, so apparently one of the big contributing factors to the civil war was that people who were becoming internal climate refugees, they were met with like a ruthless repression as opposed to aid programs, and that caused the war. Or if we take Gaza, much of their problem is scarcity, like mismanagement of water to the point that they no longer have natural drinkable water.
And just a question, Isaac, I'm sorry.
Yeah, what can we do about governance, resilience, supporting local communities, and reducing the degree of authoritarianism and repression?
Okay, Andrew?
Really good question. I don't have an off-pat answer. If I started waffling, he'd cut me off. I don't.
Is it the
it's
right?
It's a really important question. I just don't have something really quick and
right.
clever.
And is it worth saying that your book isn't really looking at that answer? It is posing in ink the link between climate change and conflict. And Isaac's question is massive and relevant. So what we're saying is, for the purposes of talking about this book, you haven't addressed it, but you're with Isaac on his question. So it's just that it's too big. The book is only 300 pages long, so much less. It's a very speedy read. It's not me controlling the microphone. It's our friends from the Conduit.
Hi, Sadiq Karimbo. I just moved here from Asia. I have a very simple question from your perspective, which is, what does all this mean for the United Nations, which is being defunded slowly, and we sort of saw what happened in September. And given your insights into that organization, given the problems you just talked about, what is the future of that organization? Or indeed, does something happen to that organization that results us to change behavior in some way?
It's not terribly relevant to this discussion now, but it's hugely interesting to me, that question. As you said, I mean, I worked for 30 years for the UN. It's going through a really bad phase at the moment. I see this as a cyclical thing. It's going to come out the other end, but it really is in a bad way, and we're only in the 9th month of Trump, so it's going to get a lot worse. And maybe it can get a bit revitalized when there's a new Secretary General and there will be a move for reform, but right now I don't have much hope for it. Can I pass you another drink, Lily?
Yeah. There's only 5 minutes left. This lady on the front is blaming me for not being called when it's Lily's fault. The microphone's at the back now. Yes?
Thank you. Lots of people think that AI will save us all, but what I can see is that AI can make everything worse, especially in terms of climate change. I wanted to know what was your vision about how it can be of help, or will you make it everything worse?
That is such a huge question. Obviously, there are some things it can definitely help on. It can help to predict when there's going to be major weather transformations. It can help find solutions, particularly on health and some agricultural ways. Of course, there are so many downsides as well. It's a really, I don't know where the balance is, but it's definitely ups and downs.
And doesn't the use of...
And the use of power, of course.
Yeah, don't we use fresh water and to cool down the servers? Now you've got so you can't blame me now.
Thank you very much. My name's Birgit. What I don't understand is that conservative politicians are quite close normally to the security community. And if I remember correctly in your book, I think you are describing that the security community is listening to people like you. So why does that not then also influence politicians? Or in other words, also, what was the reception of your book?
I got asked to speak to a large community in the Pentagon, actually, about it. And there is something in it, and I must say I've been disappointed, but I had a moment of hope when I was in Iraq. Tom Friedman wrote a book about the Earth is getting flat, or I can't remember what it's called. Yeah, thank you. And
that's Isaac again.
Is he Thomas Friedman?
No, he's trying to get on this podium.
And he came up, and that the U.S. military, he said that we're going to out-green Al-Qaeda was how he put it, because they realized, and I can see that too, FOBs, forward operating bases, what was happening, they were using an immense amount of fuel for their air conditioning in the unbelievable heat of the Anbar Desert. So what would happen, they would send convoys and they would get shot and blown up, convoys of fuel. So they started doing a lot of solar power, and Friedman predicted that this would be they would then go back to their home communities, particularly from conservative red states, and they would go back and preach the gospel of environmentalism. Alas, that didn't happen. But there have definitely been, and both in the US and the UK, and in Germany too, there are people who, in the military, who absolutely do understand that it is integral to their national security that they can have that we reduce the amount of missions.
Okay, so the session's coming to an end only because it was agreed it would end now. Andrew is available to sign his book. If I can summarize, we're in a room full of people who know everything about this subject, and they've kept their attention on you, Andrew, for the whole time. You've been really kind and very attentive. And also there are reasons to be cheerful, not many, but they include some agricultural advantage, they include changes, they include some cooperation, they include some intelligent people, many of whom are in the room. There are reasons, but there is an awful lot of challenge which is addressed here. And for doing it, Andrew, tonight in such a sort of short space of time, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and to everyone at Conduit.